Hi everyone, and welcome to the 8th in our series of commentaries on the crisis, in which we're intending to bring insights into the way businesses are changing, the stages of that change, and how we can recognize these changes, and how we need to, as HR and finance professionals, best react, and what signs we should be looking for, and therefore how we best respond to the crisis as it unfolds. We'll be focusing today mainly on the second stage of the pandemic and the crisis, which is really about replanning and re-envisaging what the future is going to be like, as most of us, thankfully, have passed the more reactive stage, which we'll be reflecting on somewhat. So today I'm delighted that Rupert McNeil, the Chief People Officer for Government, has joined us. And Rupert, to some extent, has been in the eye of the storm, as we all know, because the daily correspondence, daily news is about government and its reaction. And so I'm really excited about Rupert's reflections on what's been going on. So welcome, Rupert, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, Tom. Great to be here.
So I'd like to thank everyone else for attending and just acknowledge the fact that we've got a broad range of attendees, from people who are HR professionals and parts of teams to project directors and HRDs. So welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining this. There is a question box during the event, so please pop your questions into that, and I will be answering them alone because Rupert has to run at the end of the broadcast later on. So thank you everybody again for coming. Today we're going to try and complete three things. We're going to look a little bit at the anatomy of this crisis and how it's unfolded, and try and reflect on the stages it's going for and it's going through, and put that into some kind of context. Then we're going to be focusing on practical examples of businesses which have been in the midst of this, and particularly focusing on government. And then thirdly, draw lessons from these experiences to better equip ourselves to understand the stages that businesses are passing through. So for a note, what we're covering and what we're not covering. So we're going to be talking about the stages which business is going through and how that's reflected. We're not going to be talking about the personal experience, the psychology of it personally, because neither Rupert nor I are qualified to reflect on that, and there are many other webinars which can focus on that area. It's really about the business psychology and how that is changing through this period. So a few words about Veran Performance. Veran Performance, as you know, is a business transformation consultancy. We work with government and other entities on transformation of services and improvement of those, often through technology. So to start, this pandemic, make no mistake, is both the largest health crisis any of us have ever seen in our lives, and also the largest business crisis. And so understanding the anatomy is more important than ever. Crises and business crises tend to follow three stages. The first of these is a chaotic, reactive stage, which we've all seen, and hopefully most of us, if not all of us, have passed through now. This stage is characterized by needing to set people up in different ways of working, deal with immediate and overwhelming business priorities which change daily, etc. And that stage is, I'm hoping, for most of us now past, and even a distant memory for some of us. And then that is followed by a replanning stage, which is looking at what the future might look like, how we, in many cases, get people back to work or back to their normal environment, and how we also plan for the third stage, which is the new reality. Because I think in this case, and the scale of this crisis is such that that none of us really think that we'll be going back to anything which directly replicates where we were 12 or 14 weeks ago. So in order, I'd like to just talk a little bit about the reactive and chaotic stage, and then invite Rupert to give us his comments and thoughts on that stage. So what I observed during this stage is that we were making a series of temporary decisions that may or may not have proved to be correct. We were focusing on logistical corrections that took an enormous amount of activity to sort out. So it was activities such as getting computers to people, like allowing them going into tools to be able to work in different environments, and short-term changes to try and stabilize things and get things going. Our experience, and many of the people we've spoken to, for example, doing stuff which was unheard of in HR and people terms. We were looking at furloughing staff in large numbers when nobody even knew really what the legal meaning of furlough was. And yet we made and brought enormous change, more change than we've probably seen for years and years or could possibly envisage in a matter of a small few weeks. So, Rupert, I'd like to invite you in. Well, how was that stage from your perspective as chief people officer of government?
Great question, Tom. So probably worth putting it into a bit of context, first of all, which is that there are 450,000 individuals, roughly, in the civil service. But that is across multiple organisations, some of them very small with tens of people, some of them enormous, like the MOD, the MOJ, Prison Service, HMRC and DWP. Pretty much every type of working environment, from stables to a lab to a retail environment, a sort of job centre really is, to call centres, it all exists somewhere in that in the government sector. If I sort of think about it like that. So that's the context. And as we know, that means the responses are very different. That's multiple business models, or as we've started to think about it and called it, concepts of operations. And that's very relevant to this point about how you react to the immediate and evolving situation. But a couple of introductory things first on that. First of all, I went for my constitutional walk a few weeks ago and overheard a conversation where someone was saying, well, this was a black swan event. Of course, this was not a black swan. This was about as bleached white a swan as you could imagine. And for many of us, and many people on this call, pandemic was something that was always on our risk registers. We've been expecting something like this to happen. And just worth bearing that in mind.
Yes.
Because it was a very, very important, and it happens. It's probably 100 years since we had one of this scale. My grandmother was ill in the 1918 pandemic, the influenza pandemic. These things they're a factor of human history. So, and my first encounter with it actually was in the 70 Whitehall Cabinet Office coffee shop with the Permanent Secretary for Department of Health and Social Care and the Chief Medical Officer saying, look, this is coming. This was probably in late January. We need to get people into DHSC to start planning for this. And that's interesting because the key thing is to stay ahead of it, particularly if you're in our area, which is all about workforce and capability, to make sure that you have the first of all, you have an operating model into which you can slot people, and that you are able to move people of different types swiftly. And for us, that was actually easier than it might have been for some organisations, because through the sort of 3 drills that we ran over the past 18 months, getting ready for a possible no-deal EU exit, we had learned a huge amount about moving people around government, using functions as a way to identify those people. And really, we had our workforce planning muscles had been developed. Not probably enough, but they'd been developed more than if we hadn't had that. And so we first of all needed to basically activate that mechanism, which is saying, so what's the demand, first of all? What are the obstacles to fulfilling that demand? Can you reorganise yourselves to make better use of different types of people? We have some quite deployable resources that we can put out there, like surge apprentices and operational delivery, civil service fast streamers, and other people. So we did that. Now, the operating model is then a really interesting question, because, of course, the distinguishing feature about this is that if you're able to have people working at home or let's put it slightly differently, remotely, working remotely, actually the disruption to business flow is surprisingly small, to be a bit provocative. And so one of the first things we did was, across these very different contexts, we can break down, and this is with the HR directors, about 60 of us, and we were meeting every day for half an hour. We now meet every 2 days to talk about these issues. How do we sort of think about that population? So the first thing we did was to say the population is basically in 4 categories. There are category 1 people who are able, because they've got the kit, to work from home. And really they can just get going on it. Now there will be an impact on working at home, because they may have caring responsibilities, children, parents, whatever, that have to be taken into account, but basically they can work from home. Second stage is people who could work from home if we can get the kit to them. Now some areas had a concept of operations that allowed that, others did not, because they didn't have enough mobile kit. So the priority then shifts to getting that kit, or getting kit that you've got to the people at home. Third category is people who just have to work where they are, people in the border force, prison officers, etc. And then the fourth category, which is an important one to bear in mind, are people who can't work at home. They might be people who are in flat shares. They might be people whose well-being is affected if they work at home. So we need to find another place for them to work, but it might not be their normal workplace. And we've kept that typology all through this period. And the numbers I saw today, because we've just done another survey, this one of colleagues, suggests that we're certainly north of 75% of people working from home.
Wow.
Across that 450,000. Now that is remarkable. Mm-hmm. I won't say more about that, because we'll talk about the next part of the conversation about what the implications of that are, because they're very exciting. But as a hint, that's like 6 years, 16 years of change compressed into 6 weeks.
So, Rupert, you were bringing together 60 HRDs from different departments with really radically different services they're providing every day. That's extraordinary.
Well, and what they then have is that that's a great piece of co-creation. So we have, if I sort of take an example, so we're probably now on version 10 of our remote working guidance. We have sent out, received, and we're now on version 2 of our D&I impact assessment, because one of the things which we've been keen to emphasize is that this is an environment which actually is very helpful for some people who've been underrepresented. I mean, one description that was given to me was, we live in a world which has been designed for male right-handed extroverts. And now we're in a, that's perhaps not, the world isn't perhaps organised to the advantage of that group as in the way it was. But so you've got a set of issues. You've got some specific issues about people who are, as I said, have got caring responsibilities. What does that mean? You've got some interesting issues around different demographic groups, different people with disabilities. So I would say that there's probably a net positive experience for underrepresented groups through this, and learning a lot. I'll come on to the cultural point in a minute, but also the kurtosis is high. So there's a tail, a long tail of people for whom it isn't necessarily so good, and we need to look after them. So that's been interesting. We've really been thinking about the cultural aspects of this. So the two big things for me that have come out of this, one is I think people who, when you've got cabinet meetings and cabinet ministers and senior officials all doing Zoom, interacting as you and I are now, Tom, that has lots of different effects. First of all, it makes people question whether they need to be physically present to have to work together. In fact, an interesting theme that seems to be emerging in a number of places is that sometimes these interactions are, the ones we're having like ours now, are more intimate, more authentic than if you're sitting across a table, particularly if you now have to sit at least 2 meters away from the individuals across the table. So that's one aspect. And how these are actually quite leveling and hierarchy compressing ways of working. So that's something we definitely want to capture. But it does require more skills. It requires skills about how you use the chat, what's the etiquette, all of those things. So that's a really interesting thing which we take into the next phase about what.
Yes, well, I'd like to pick up on that actually, Rupert, because that's something which I've heard regularly in these events. So we had the chair of business psychology group who was looking at it from another aspect, and he was describing exactly a flavour of what you're describing, which is that we're all used to, or most of us are used to, environments where leadership comes from the top down, and we are told what to do, and then we do what we're told, or don't do what we're not told to do. And his observation was that during this crisis, that's been turned on its head. So a lot of people who otherwise, they could see all the barriers and were not getting the, leadership, which kind of partly was an excuse to not do things, but it was also a kind of the barrier to doing things. So, for example, doctors who are moved to doing consultations online. Now, there were 1,000 reasons why not to do that previously, but the necessity to do it meant that they kind of picked up whatever machine they needed to do, put together whatever controls they could to make it as safe as possible, but then got on with it because the need was greater. And I think this is a very interesting aspect. When I was talking to retail HRD, they were saying, I've got to listen to what people on the ground are talking about because safety is our most critical element. And if, I don't know what's safe in that particular store in Shoreditch or whatever, but that person does. So their view is more important. And you're seeing that too
you described it really well, Tom. I think that's exactly what's happening, and I think the other point that you've touched on is, again, this back to this idea of concept of operations, which I would really just recommend everyone needs to think about all the time. How elastic is it? What could you do differently? I mean, I genuinely don't believe that the way people interact with their GP will be the same again. Why would it need to be?
Why would it be? Yes.
And you've got similar changes happening in other areas as well. So that's a big thing. And talking to my sort of international counterparts, I was talking to Nancy, my counterpart in Canada, David, my counterpart in Dublin. We're all seeing these things in public services, which is really interesting. Very, very similar things. The other thing I just did want to mention though, about the what we've learned. The phrase which it's always interesting coming across new words in your job, and the one that we're probably familiar with in other contexts of working with Varan is the idea of transactability. That's a great, once you name the fact that people don't fill in forms on self-service correctly and say that's a transactability problem, that's a very helpful concept. The phrase which is now emerging is interoperability as a goal. When you find that, there were 2,000 people in a call center you could have used, but you can't because the specs on their IT and their processes are not transferable unless you make some changes, that's an interoperability problem. So, and that's back to the concept of operations. So some people's concept of operations have not taken into account interoperability as much as they should. And now senior leadership, political and management is looking at that and saying, well, actually, we want to change that and make sure that doesn't happen.
I'm very excited about that. When we get on to the next part, I think maybe we should revisit that a little bit, because it's something I recognise. It's a classic government challenge. Back in the day when we used to have normal downturns, you'd have this thing where DWP would suddenly get very busy and need many people, and HMRC would get very unbusy because their activity was less, and yet kind of getting the people from here to there without going through a ridiculous dance of them losing their jobs in one place and then being brought up in the other one. was always a challenge. So I'm really interested in.
Just to clarify on that, Tom. So what's interesting about this crisis, this period, is that they've both been really busy, and I think it's very interesting. Huge kudos to the staff and leadership in both DWP and HMRC. So if I think about universal credit and how quickly that's been able to respond to this, and also the setting up of furlough, it's an HMRC exercise. It's been done incredibly rapidly. Now that's another example of how I think this is showing not just the art of the possible in operations, but the art of the possible in outcomes. And that's really, really interesting that could be done as swiftly as it has been.
Yes, that is true. I was, thinking, I was trying to identify in my head the areas of government which have become less busy, and I'm not sure if I can really identify what they are, because all of the services must have been under very significant strain throughout the pandemic. And
I've got to do a plug here, because we're about to go and do a big recruitment campaign for senior civil servants, deputy directors and directors. We've moved a lot of people around, but new things are being set up. So there's new task forces to deal with vaccines, testing, etc. New parts of bays and other places. And anyway, we're going up. Those jobs will be up on gov.uk shortly. One of the things that characterises those jobs, it might be of interest to people listening to this call, is that they are about this interface between policy and delivery, with people who've got good commercial acumen and get technology. So I very much hope that some of the viewers of this, Tom, will be interested in that.
Well, I think they will, and but I also think that one of the long-term barriers for people moving from one type of work into government in the past has been this perception that things in government are quite hard and sticky to move forward. And it's kind of, do I really want to be fighting that fight for 18 months or whatever before something gets done? I think that, and I hope that, one of the things out of the pandemic is that some of that will be left behind, and that the government will be able to retain some of this ability to do things fast and not being perceived to be held back by the I don't know what it is. You know better than I do.
I'm only a civil servant of sort of 4.5 years, and I would say that the ability for government to deliver change in a particular area is probably faster than most parts of the private sector.
Yeah,
and that's an interesting. There are a lot. It's one for another webinar, but there are a number of reasons for that. And actually, one of my a colleague before I joined, who joined government, said he was very struck that things either took a very long time to do or they happened really quickly. And I think that's sort of what you're seeing, and also converging on the happy medium. So, but you're right. It's a great environment to be in, and I think that what we hope is that and preparing for coming out of lockdown is a good example of this. We hope we can be a bit of a benchmark for others to have a look at, again, because so many of the different operating environments are represented within the civil service. And we also have the other great thing is we've got a scheme where furlough staff have been coming in to support, provide some of that government resource, which has been a really great thing to see.
That's a great thing to do. This is really exciting stuff. As a long-term fan of government, I'm delighted to hear all of this, because I do think it really matters, and that interoperability where people in our country, some people are having a hard time and great difficulties, and with great skills at the same time. and to be able to kind of tap into that would be will be fantastic.
Yeah.
The head of one of the NHS trusts who came on some weeks ago said to me that they felt that they'd made 5 years progress in 5 weeks in using different technology, etc. They were so excited about the changes which previously they didn't think they could do. So that brings us on to the second stage of the pandemic, which was really actually replanning and reframing for the new future. So all of our businesses at some stage are moving into the point of actually thinking about what the new future is going to look like. What are the things which they need to plan for, and actually what the new services provided by, in particular, HR teams, HR services, and other services to the front line and the businesses need to be. What we're seeing is an awful lot of people are saying that they're going to be looking again at those services. So expensive services which seem to be kind of highly tailored to an organization and expensive to run are something which a lot of businesses seem to be seeking to re-examine, because there's the side being, or the justification being that actually with staff members in difficulty and colleagues on furlough and all this kind of stuff, that actually it's appropriate to give a more tailored, a less tailored service and a more standard service, which I think is quite interesting. I think also that the nature of the service which people need has changed almost overnight, because we were used to face-to-face support from our service colleagues often, and a kind of a lack of discipline to that service to some extent, which I think it has kind of changed. Plus, the underlying fact, which is that people need different set of services when they're working in different environments from what they're used to than they did previously. So this replanning and reframing stage, I think, is giving quite a lot of us opportunities to think again about what that future might look like. But also to try and build on some of the reflections of the positive sides of what we've done and managed over the last kind of 12 weeks. So I don't know, Rupert, can I call on you to make some comments on that? What are your thoughts?
Definitely. Well, let me say what I think probably the most important thing, and the concern I've got is, so in about 1999, I was in Canada and I broke both my wrists in a biking accident, and I had them reset in a little village hospital in Canada. Canada, interesting, because it has a national health service like us. And I went home back to the UK and went to get the casts taken off, and the orthopedic surgeon said, there are 2 types of fracture A and fracture B, and you've got fracture A, but they did it like fracture B, so we're going to have to break it and put in a plate. So now I say that sort of half jokingly, because if you want to sort of put it in sort of semi-theoretical terms, I think it's Kurt Lewin who said, you want to unfreeze, make your change, refreeze. And the risk that we've got is that we're actually in an unfrozen state at the moment, and we want to make sure that this all freezes back in the right way. Now, the metaphor we actually use in our conversations in government is among the Director Generals and Permanent Secretaries, we don't want snapback. That's another phrase, a de jure. We don't want snapback. So what do we not want to snap back on? And that would be things like the insidious expectation that people would be better off in the office. Well, we're putting in some very, very clear messages. No, for all sorts of reasons, public transport, everything else, if you can do your job from home, you should keep doing a job from home. How do we make sure that some of the hierarchical things we've talked about and innovative things we've talked about stick? The innovation, how do we make sure that sticks? How do we actually make sure, because this will not be the last 21st century thing. So how do we actually make sure that we've got the interoperability sorted out and we come out of this more resilient than when we went in? And that's going to be quite hard. If I take one particular example about what this means strategically, we have an estate strategy. We have a very firm commitment to having jobs much more represented around the UK and out of the southeast, London and southeast. But that has been articulated in other centres. Now, we knew that there was a risk that we didn't want to create 5 or 6 Londons as a solution to the London situation. So that was already in our minds. But this reinforced it, because it said, well, actually, we're sort of, do we have a model where we move people into big hubs, or actually does this show that we could have a much more distributed model, which is, to use another phrase we tend to use, location agnostic, that people should be able to work where they need to work, where they want to work. So that's quite a big task, which takes us to sort of location strategy for the civil service 2.0 or even 3.0 compared to where we were even 5 months ago. So how do you get that in? And the other thing in a corporate services function like HR, particularly HR, which is by its nature very B2C, whereas some other functions are more B2B, it's about the operating model, what the expectations are. So what I've said to the people who look after the operating model in HR and our processes and our systems and our technology investment is, why aren't we just going to say that everything should be digital by default? Mm-hmm. So all those processes, ranging from coaching and mediation to recruitment to management meetings to training, the absolute default should be it can be delivered digitally. There's no need for there to be face-to-face presence. That's not to say there won't be times when I say default, not a requirement, because in some cases it will be important to have face-to-face interaction for various reasons. But it shouldn't be that the starting point should be that it's not necessary for what we do. And that's and so I think if I sort of quote one of my great colleagues, Mike Green, is the Chief Operating Officer for DFE, which has been very innovative in this and also played a blinder with schools, is to say, well, what must be true? What are we seeing through this period which absolutely must be true? That's one of them. You don't need to be doing lots of things face to face, and so that's how we're approaching it. But also, I think I draw a lot of lessons from the process of getting ready for remote working. That took us a number of weeks. It was very iterative. Problems we weren't aware of popped up. We needed to clarify them. You can see similar issues arising with the return to work. To take an example, I think it's quite important that the concepts that are being used around things like, there is clinical grade PPE, personal protective equipment, and then there are face coverings. And they're different things. Yeah. But they're quite easy to conflate, from 100,000 feet. So, yes. And that comes back to, what is the actual guidance you need? And we had a good conversation today with a number of chief operating officers about face coverings and about what the expectation is. And the risk of sending mixed messages. If you need PPE for your job, if you need personal protective equipment for your job, you should have it, obviously. So why would we, and if we're practicing social distancing in the workplace, which we are, why would you need face coverings? Is it because it gives people reassurance? Well, actually face coverings protect other people, not yourself. So that's an interesting thing. And where I think we're getting to with this, I expect, is, well, face coverings are really about, it's commuting. That's the issue where transport providers are saying you need PPE. So not PPE, you need face coverings rather than PPE. So, and I think there are going to be lots of issues like that will need to be thought through. Another minor one, not minor, but another one is occupancy rates. People have probably been a bit surprised about how few people you could have in a place when there's a 2 meter social distancing.
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's another example. So we're going to go through some periods of, you know, a little bit of turbulence as that stuff settles and we learn, and we shouldn't be sorry that we're learning. And I expect in 3 weeks' time we'll have version 10 of our return to the office return to the workplace guidance. So but that shouldn't conceal or shouldn't distract from the fact there are some really big lessons we've learned that we want to embed, behavioural, cultural, and operational.
I mean, these are substantial changes for our managers, I think, because many managers in many businesses are used to a culture of supervision, a culture of direct face-to-face support, and actually this is a very different way of supporting their staff and monitoring their work, etc. So I think that, you know, actually supporting our managers in understanding how to do that and what is the appropriate level of independent or separate supervision and support, I think is something which is a bit of a learning curve.
And that's important too. I mean, there's in the context of giving people the skills to do that. I mean, this actually is an environment which requires, for things to work smoothly, it requires, I mean, you alluded to it earlier, Tom, you know, this is about pushing decision-making to the front line, and that includes first-line managers and supervisors and trusting people and giving them discretion, which is good. That's all good. That's exactly what we want to be doing anyway. I think there's also an issue about just about well-being and making sure that people feel that we recognise that different groups are going to have different sources of stress, even if it's just the fact that things are changing. So if you were someone who got a lot of comfort by opening your door and seeing people working outside it, you know, that's fair enough. I'm not saying that's the best management.
And Rupert, not everybody likes working from home, I hear.
No, they don't. And that's why I think it's really, so I think that moves us into something we've been thinking about, which is, you know, you should be able to work where you work best. Mm-hmm. So I think I hope what we're going to see with this, with the technology, with the more sort of flexible approach to where people can work and what we expect of them, is a much more, well, I think about it as mass customization of the employee offer. Actually, that's what we want to get to, and I think that's entirely achievable. And I guess part of my general feeling about this whole experience is that the 21st century started in February 2020.
Oh, that's very nice. I like that. That's a yes. I think that's probably true. I mean, yes, the things I'm kind of reflecting on from our conversation are really about how the speed of change which we had to get used to, and how much of that we kind of want to embrace going forward in some form or another to be designed. I think there's sympathy for people's minds changing, things not being exactly definite. This is the priority we believed it was, but we've discovered subsequently it is wrong after talking to our staff or whatever. And I think that's very interesting. It's that dialogue with staff and team members, which I think is really positive, because actually we never knew what stopped people behaving and doing the things which as organizations we wanted them to do, but they did. And actually getting that voice, I think, is really exciting.
And Tom, goes well to multi-channel management. You know, it's about having the video call on whatever your platform of choice is, having the picking up the phone, sending the text, the WhatsApp message. I'm really struck by how multi-channel my interactions are with both people above, below, peers. It's very I actually enjoy that. I think it's good. And really, in a way, using this as a time too to get to know the people in one's teams better. I was talking to one of my direct reports about that today, and we were saying, well, actually, we're probably spending more time talking than we were before. And interestingly, that was someone who spent a lot, who has been working remotely. So yeah, it's exciting. I mean, the circumstances are tragic.
Yes.
They should be a wake up call to everybody, because I don't believe that in the next sort of our working lives we'll see other things like this, whether they're pandemics or something else. I'm a huge fan, by the way, of everything that Nicholas Taleb has written, and I really recommend people to look at that. From Fooled by Randomness to Anti-Fragile, he describes the way I think everyone should think about the world. We underestimate high impact, low probability events, and it's be ready. And actually, a conversation Peter Cheese and I had thinking about the CIPD chief executive. What do we need to learn from this? Well, look at your business continuity plans, understand your concept of operations, understand how you would change it. I do think this is where a function, I mean, someone put it this way, that Peter described it, 2008 was about the finance function. This particular crisis is about the HR function, and shows you what is expected, and a lot is expected of us as a function.
That is true. I mean, it's interesting. So we had the HRD of one of the big financial services organisations a couple of weeks ago, who was talking about the fact that financial services, because of their crisis in 2008, have been practicing serious crisis management with a level of speed and severity, which many other organisations have not been taking as seriously. And but what was really interesting is they said much of that was defeated because of the global scale. So if you are a large global bank, your crisis management was to move things to Thailand or Singapore, and in this crisis, it turned out that Singapore was closed in advance of London. So, yeah. Although the checklists and the methodologies which they created were incredibly useful, the actual envisaged nature of what they were going to do in a crisis was defeated. So, the governance was effective, but the actual expected steps turned out to be completely different from what they.
Well, and on that point, Tom, I think one of the really interesting tools to help prepare for this type of thing is red teaming. It's a great one of the many great documents on the MOD part of gov.uk is the red teaming guidance and how to run red teaming, and I think that I'd be encouraging everybody to think about, however small your organisation is, getting someone in that you trust to be able to look at it and ask the questions about whether you've actually considered this. Like, what's and that by the way is a very important part, a lesson of this, which is go back, and we did this during the period of preparing for No Deal EU exit. Across our HR directors, we did an exercise which we updated on a number of occasions, which was a matrix that basically said, here are 10 events that could happen. Pandemic was one, because pandemic should be on every HR practitioner's list of things that could happen. To general election, that happened. A range of different things by department. What will that mean for resourcing? And what happens when 3 of those things happen together? Are we resilient enough to deal with that compounding? And that's a really important tool, I think.
Oh, that's very interesting. That sounds like that brings us back to almost where you started talking about interoperability and how to make that working across organizations.
And that to me is about, so one of the other things we learned with EU exit is supply isn't actually the problem. You can always fix a supply problem. I think the issue is the demand problem and understanding what it is that you're doing. And actually, I had a really interesting conversation with one of my colleagues who's been very involved in the ventilator challenge. And he was saying, well, ventilators are really, really complicated machines. And they're actually complicated from and by the way, the ventilator situation is, that was addressed basically, but it's when you get into the tiny components and valves, which themselves are made up of multiple components, which come from multiple suppliers in northern Italy and places like that. You need to understand that, and the common and the importance of common specification and securing supply. So understanding your operations, that is a really critical thing, and that means and from an HR perspective, what do you actually need? Do you and that comes back to sort of, I tend to think of this in terms of levels of maturity of organizational thinking. So you've got the least sophisticated level, which I suspect many people on this call still encounter, is I want that person in this job. Well, what happens if you can't get that person? Well, I want a person like that person. That's the next level of sophistication. And then it's, well, actually, what is that? What is it about that person? And then you break it down to a roles profile. And then you can start looking at the role profile and saying, well, really, is that actually what you need? What activities need to be performed in your operating model? And what is the best way to distribute those activities by jobs? Do you really need a doctor to draw blood? No. But you do need someone who can draw blood. So where do you draw that from? So there's and one of the main skills, I think, for HR practitioners is to be able to be thinking forensically about that. And the exciting thing is that then takes you into other areas, because once you're thinking about that, you have to be thinking about enterprise architecture and about process design and being able to contribute in that. And you might have people saying, well, this is a process we'd like. And you say, well, that's great, but it's going to take you 6 weeks to find those people, and we can get you these people in a week if you redesign the process in this way. So those are the types of conversations and thinking that I think this experience reinforces.
I think that's really exciting. That's a really exciting kind of final message, which is that actually we should be focusing on the demand and not the supply. I think that, 12 weeks ago in that different world, many of us as HR professionals and HRDs, etc., thought a lot about the supply, how we were going to do this, how we're doing our operation, and all that kind of stuff. And to some extent, this has brought into real relief how actually it's the demand which matters. It's what needs to be done. We can find a way of doing it, but it's that demand. And I think, if I took that as even your single lesson of the pandemic, I think that would be a great lesson to bring out of it, to actually really understanding what needs to be done and what service we need to provide, I think is a really, it's the truth of it, isn't it? Doesn't it feel a long time ago, pre this pandemic?
Long time ago, yeah.
And I must say, you did touch upon it, but obviously many of, you've got colleagues who have had very difficult times, both work-wise and also health-wise, etc., through this. And so, amongst those 500,000, I imagine there's been real tough and continue to be tough times.
If I could just make one final point there, Tom, on that, which is that I think with the return to work, we're very conscious that that could be, we need to be very vigilant about that. So the very positive levelling effect of everyone, like I said, almost 80% of people working from home is, now if people start working differently, some people will not be able to do that because they'll be shielded, they'll be with shielded people. So how do you make sure those people are feeling protected? And equally, all through this period, we've had colleagues, prison officers and others, people in job centres who've actually been out doing their normal job in their normal context, albeit in a more socially distanced way. So really interesting to think about that and how we, if I take the example of the worst, let's go back to the worst type of meeting where any of us on this call are at the end of a phone while the rest of the people are all in the room having a meeting, that type of thing. That's what we don't want to go back to.
Yes, yeah, that's very true, and it's also making me think that the avoidance of a kind of second spike, etc., occurring later in the year is there's an HR responsibility in our ability as an industry and a sub-industry to be able to respond to that, so that we create safe working places and we create environments in which people can work, because otherwise we're all going to be locked up again later in the year. So I guess, as you say, it does put HR on the front line and the activities we do in a way which we haven't been for a little while. So, Rupert, it's been delightful to talk to you today. Thank you so much for your thoughts. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone else for attending today. I hope that was really useful. It was great to hear from the government sector and Rupert's thoughts on what's going on there, and some really interesting insights about the changes there. So thank you, everybody. Any questions I'll be answering on my own at the end of the event in a little while, so we'll pick those up in a minute. But again, thank you very much. We're running other webinars on other areas, and of course this is a weekly series. So I look forward to seeing you again soon, and thank you all. And again, thank you very much, Rupert.
Thanks, Tom.
Great.